realized its inherent dilemma. I quote, "Such a research very often bears an advocative, justifying character, exaggerating the good qualities and diminishing the deficiencies, but the reason for this advocacy is the holiest feeling, the love for your fatherland, and the highest objective, the defense of your own nation's life." End of quote. Ivane Javakhishvili replied to Gogebashvili's statement and criticized in his article Patriotism and Science, Mamuli Shviloba da Metznereba in 1904, that advocacy science is not dedicated to scientific principles, but willing to, I quote, "accentuate the positive characteristics while minimizing its deficiencies in order to come to peace with the past as both fruitless and damaging." He stressed the fact that only a critical and reflective reception of its history would be of any use to Georgian society. I quote, "The difference between critical, scientific and common perceptions is that we conceive of our contemporary perceptions of the past as being correct, as if the dismantling and reputation of such conceptions would be tantamount to the destruction of our deeds in the past and of successful life in general." End of quote. And if I look back into the recent history, so the famous statement from philosopher Merab Mamatashvili, who was urged to decide in favor of the truth or of the nation, so this is still a quite actual point. So this could easily be translated into the present as a contemporary and honest concept of historical science. His critique was predominantly aimed at the propaganda function of national history and is embedded in a positivistic concept of true history, Cheshmariti Istoria, as it really was. Linking the young Georgian national historiography in the early 20th century up to European standards, his article Patriotism and Science can, to my point of view at least, be counted as a manifesto laying the foundations of a new cognitive strategy of the generation of historical knowledge between the perceptives of interpretation and the methods of historical discipline approach to Georgian historiography. So for me, this Mamuli Shviloba and Metznereba is the key point to start with, probably. This is his way where he lays down his concept. This general concept about the importance of the scientific history writing of the nation was predominant all over Europe between 1850 and 1950, and therefore quite timely introduced in Georgia. For Javakhishvili, the Georgian nation building process was attached to the discipline of Oriental studies. Aware of the European approaches, he was very keen to draw comparisons from Persia to Japan and not diminishing the value of Asian peoples, their cultures and histories. He realized that the Caucasian peoples, like Georgians and Armenians, were neglected in Western scholarship. And also he realized this during his study visit at Berlin University between 1901 until spring 1902. This was obligatory. As a future professor, you had to spend at least 1 year at a European university, from Petersburg or Moscow University. This tradition was really continued into the early 20s, where he met the most eminent scholar of Christian Oriental studies in Germany, Professor Adolf von Harnack. But he also studied different subjects in Berlin and brought a lot of new insight back to St. Petersburg. In his introduction to the history of the Georgian nation from 1908, Javakhishvili emphasized the importance of archaeology, linguistics, and religious studies for the early periods of a nation's history. Thus, he transcended the previously concentration on written sources and upgraded them through a multidisciplinary approach from mere auxiliary functions. Even If the nation already in ancient periods represented the analytical framework, he also admitted the importance of language contacts with other nations in that period, as an example for the mutual influence nations exerted on each other. Relying on reference works from German scholars of the Orient, he introduced new methods for the research of the Georgian nation as part of the history of the Near East. The early history of the Georgian nation seemed to consist of a distinct material heritage, language, and religion. Contacts between different cultures constituted an essential part of the concept of Georgian nation building for Javakhishvili that is based on the assumption of a migration of their predecessors from the southwest into their current habitat in the southern Caucasus. This assumption was challenged in the 30s. The migration paradigm became the dominant idea in that time. The autochthony paradigm rose with the campaign against Marism in the 1950s, locating the origins of the Georgians on the present territories of residence. So, here in Georgia. Javakhishvili also started to prepare and to establish a Georgian scientific community, first as a student circle in Petersburg, and later in his endeavor for the establishment of a national university in Tbilisi, where we're sitting here now. After his master dissertation on ancient Georgia's and Armenia's state structure in May 1907, he initiated a scientific circle for Georgian students in Petersburg to gather potential Georgian candidates as early as possible. Under his guidance, presentations and research were conducted in the Georgian language to elaborate a scholarly terminology in their mother tongue and to deal with Georgian culture in a scientific manner. This kind of activities also widens the academic readership among young Georgian students and raised their national awareness. To assess the scientific potential among students, Javakhishvili initiated in 1910 a survey among Georgians at Russian and foreign universities. This was meant to prepare the ground for a future establishment of a Georgian university in Tbilisi. What only happened, of course, after his return to Tbilisi in January 1918. This material, this survey is a quite interesting one because really they printed 1,500 forms and received back more than 700. And it gives a very good overview about the Georgian elite and their perception in that time. And this is still available and can still be investigated. And hopefully, if there will be some more time, I would really like to do this because it's great material. So from Petersburg University to Heidelberg and Paris and so on. Now I'm turning to the forms of presentation of a national past. So who is, and to the question, who is representing the nation? Already in 1880, Ilya Chavchavadze complained in the Georgian journal Droeba, I quote, "Our Kartli Stvovreba, life of Georgia, of Kartli, is not the people's history, but rather the history of our kings," end of quote. In fact, the life of Kartli represents a compilation of royal annals and dynastic narratives that might not coincide with the modern Georgian national movement's integrative needs for an identifiable, inclusive subject of its own history. On the other hand, there was a dominant perception of the Bagratid dynasty as a centralizing power and integrative center of Georgian statehood that was withstanding internal feudal lords as well as external enemies as the Persian and Ottoman empires. Consequently, most of the intellectuals researching Georgian history in the 19th century concentrated on its golden era, ranging from the reign of David the Builder until Queen Tamar. In his voluminous History of the Georgian Nation, Javakhishvili also intended to demonstrate the ancestry of the Georgians through a national master narration, back to their earliest traceable history. Ivane Javakhishvili's History of the Georgian Nation covers in 4 volumes today the political history of the Georgian people from ancient times onwards. But the first volume of this series was published 3 times in his lifetime, 1908, 1913 and 1928. And it has undergone serious revisions. And this is also something what I intend to really investigate in closer detail. What was revised? What were the reasons? What changed in this revision? And not only to concentrate on the academic 12-volume works of Ivane Javakhishvili. It's really to look at the editing policy also of himself and afterwards. So it covers the ancient period up to the 7th century AD. Besides the political history, Javakhishvili discusses forms of social relations, the origin of the Georgian people, early state structures, material and spiritual culture, ideology and beliefs. So much broader what has been produced before, so in by 19th century Georgian authors on their own history. Ethnographic and folkloristic materials have been used for the first time to investigate ancient Georgian as well as different early Christian confessions based on Georgian and foreign written sources. The second volume is starting with a historic geographical overview of ancient Georgia with all its regions and its borders and the main travel routes presented. Then it continues the presentation of Georgian history from Arab conquest in the mid-7th century until the beginning of Queen Tamar's reign in 1184. The second volume was published for the first time in 1914. So when the centrifugal powers, also movements in the Russian Empire were growing stronger, and the issue of borders, really where are the borders of potential states, became more and more important. Only after his decease in 1941, the third volume was published, which is ranging from 13th to the 14th centuries. During Javakhishvili's lifetime, so only the first part of the 4th volume, covering the 15th century, was published in 1924. But the whole volume appeared only in 1948, looking at Georgia's history in the 15th and 16th century. That means it was published posthumously. Javakhishvili planned to end with the Russian annexation in 1801, but did not manage during his lifetime to prolong his narrative into the modern era. So in his History of the Georgian Nation, he did neither provide an explanation about his methodological approach, nor introduce a proper definition of the nation. He planned to present both in a separate publication about the purpose, sources and methods of history formerly and now. This was for teaching purposes, a publication for teaching purposes. The reader had to get through the multitude of his publication to come to a clear understanding of the author's approach. It implied a scholarly or educated audience. So the ethnogenesis of the Georgians was one of the most important issues to be discussed in Javakhishvili's first volume. From the very beginning, he located Georgian and Armenian history in the context of Near Eastern history and culture. But doing so, he for the first time introduced them into world history. So I would like to